How did one conference reshape an entire continent's destiny for generations to come? 140 years ago, European powers got together here in Berlin to decide on the rules of engagement as they claimed territory in Africa. Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called the Berlin Conference at the request of Belgium's King Leopold II, who wanted the Congo Basin as his private property. The so-called Scramble for Africa by the Europeans often led to disputes between them, but the Berlin Conference provided a platform to iron out those issues. However, no indigenous African representatives attended the negotiations. African leaders had no say in what was happening to their homelands. Meanwhile, the Berlin Conference gave a boost to the European seizure of African land and resources, blatantly disregarding African sovereignty and leading to the reshaping of the continent's borders, societies, and future. Now, Germany has long promoted what's known here as memory culture. Its culture of remembrance, in reference particularly to the atrocities of the Nazi era. But its history with Africa hardly features. Now, activists are looking back at the 1884 Berlin Conference and its aftermath through a series of events and exhibitions to examine this crucial event. I went to have a look. Scholars, activists and other professionals, mostly from Africa and the diaspora, gather to discuss the past and its impact on the present. They're brought together by the Berlin-based civil society collective known as Decoloniale, which works to shine the spotlight on Berlin's colonial history and keep its legacy in focus.
The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 was, even when it happened, very consequential for the African continent, and it continues to be so, simply because the consequences, the repercussions of it have been ignored broadly in Germany. You know, number one is obviously the fact of anti-black racism. So colonialism has not entered the memory culture in Europe or in Germany broadly, and that's why we're here.
It is important to have such an event to talk about, the legacies of the Congo Conference or of the Berlin Conference, to talk about the violences that still go on, to talk about neo-colonialism, and also to inform ourselves and to learn from each other about where do we see colonialism in issues like trade, in issues like international development and issues of aid and so on and so forth.
It was right here 140 years ago where the European colonial powers gathered for the Berlin Africa Conference. Now, the building where they met no longer exists. It was damaged in World War II and was later demolished. What does exist, though, is this plaque, which commemorates the event and contains some important historical information. But it's easy to miss as one walks past here. And that's somewhat symbolic of the way in which the Berlin Conference and its lasting legacies are remembered in this part of the world. This modest display at the site highlights the African resistance to the European colonial scramble, as well as the ongoing civil society efforts to keep the conversation alive. It's part of a series of exhibitions arranged with Berlin's Museum Foundation. At St. Nicholas Church, now a museum, there are two exhibitions on various aspects of colonialism and its legacy, including who is honored or ignored in European museums.
Well, we really hope that memorization, commemoration of colonial but also anti-colonial history in Europe and in Germany, which hosted the Berlin Conference, was sort of that it moves more into the mainstream, into the center of society, and becomes sort of like normal part of memory culture that gets acknowledged and that ultimately finds its way into the curricula. That hasn't gone very far yet, so we hope that in a way also to accept that this happened here and not to be in denial, because broader society is, but broader society is also in denial on the consequences of colonialism.
The 2024 Berlin Africa Conference concluded with strong demands from the panel of experts on issues ranging from human rights to trade, as a call for European powers to account for their colonial legacies. I'm now joined by Dipo Faloyin, journalist and author of the book Africa is Not a Country. Welcome to the program, Dipo. Now, in your book, you make the link between the colonial era and its impact today. When you look back at this Berlin Conference and 140 years on, how would you sum up this kind of commemoration, if we were to describe it that way?
Yeah, I think for me, and thank you for having me today, I think for me the most important thing is using this as an opportunity to remember what happened at the Berlin Conference and how it has impacted the foundations of modern Africa. I think it goes beyond simply just commemorating this event and acknowledging it happened, but ensuring that going forward, this event is at the core of what we teach young people about the history of colonialism and the impact that that had on the 54 countries across Africa. I think there's such a misunderstanding of the importance of this event. A lot of people just assume that it simply was an event in which colonial powers came together and chose which parts of Africa they wanted, but actually that isn't the case. What actually happened was that they set about a series of rules that would go about how they would carve up the continent. And also importantly, they created these myths and stereotypes about Africa as being savages and uncivilized people with uncivilized communities, this idea of a dark continent. And so for me, the really, really essential thing is ensuring that, this remembrance is an opportunity for us to actually inject into our schools and into our common society an opportunity to learn more about the realities of what the Berlin Conference did and the impact that colonialism has had across the continent.
Before we go into sort of the legacy, how would you respond to people who see this kind of conversation and say, well, that happened so long in the past, we need to move on?
Yeah, so, I think for me, the most important thing is understanding our history is key so we don't make the same mistakes looking into the future. And that has been one of the problems with this discussion is that we do not understand the history. And so therefore, we keep making the same mistakes currently. And, we see a lot of evidence that we're going to keep making the same mistakes into the future. We keep talking about Africa as if it's one big country. We keep talking about Africa as if it's a place that people can simply just go in and take from it whatever they like. We keep talking about Africa in the way in which the colonialists talked about Africa as a place of people who couldn't look after themselves and who were helpless and have no agency of their own. And so that is why these conversations are important. It's not simply, a historical discussion. It's a current modern discussion. It's essential to our understanding of the ongoing conversations around returning stolen artifacts, for example. All these things are linked together. And so it's not simply just something that happened 140 years ago. A lot of the legacies of that conference and what ensued speaks to our current present reality. And that's why it's really essential for me that as many people as possible understand the realities of the Berlin Conference and the impact that it's had on African countries to this day.
Can you break some of that down for us, some of the impacts, whether social, cultural, or whatever else, as a result of the Berlin Conference that we're still seeing to this day?
Yeah, absolutely. And so as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that the attendees at the conference did was that they decided to come up with a myth to justify going in and stealing the land for themselves. They had sent explorers into the regions who told them that Africa was a wonderful place full of incredible communities and natural resources and artifacts. And so after deciding that they were going to go in and steal the land and steal these artifacts for themselves and rule over these people, they knew that they needed to come up with some sort of justification as to why they should be allowed to do it. And so they came up with the myths that Africans were savages, uncivilized people who couldn't look after themselves. And so as a result, the colonialists were coming to save Africans from themselves and to introduce what they called the 3 Cs, which was commerce, Christianity, and civilization. And then after agreeing upon the rules in which they could go in there and essentially, as long as you could force a local population under your will and you were the first European country to arrive on a piece of land, you could have that land for yourself. They set about through violence. We see that in the creation of the Congo Free State and what we now know as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where as a result of King Leopold's reign, about half the population were killed. That's about 10 million people. We see that violence in the divide and rule policies that were created, especially by the British, who created particularly large countries like the one that I'm in now, Nigeria, which has over 250 different languages and a multitude of ethnic groups. And they created these countries with as many different ethnic groups as possible to create as much instability as possible within these countries, to make it hard for these countries to exist beyond colonialism. And then we see it through, for example, the borders as well, these straight line borders that tore through ethnic groups. About 10% of all of the borders in Africa, about 30% of all the borders in Africa are simply just straight lines. And these split up about 10% of all ethnic groups across the region. And so you can imagine how devastating that would be for these communities. So, fundamentally, it's important to remember that what the Berlin Conference did was that it created countries that were essentially built to fail. That's the legacy of the conference. And that's really what's important for people to understand today.
When we think back about this, and you mentioned some of the horrors that happened during colonialism, why do you think when that topic is brought up, there is a kind of reluctance to discuss it? At least in this part of the world.
Yeah, certainly. I think for a lot of people, they've tied colonialism to their own personal identities, especially in the United Kingdom, where the idea of the British Empire for a certain generation is something that they are meant to be extremely proud of. And that is something that they grew up with, learning culturally in communities. And there was a lack of education in schools about the realities of colonialism and what it actually meant. And so, for too long, people have thought of colonialism as simply, this sort of trade agreements between countries. They don't understand the violence at the heart of colonialism. They don't understand the impact that it has had on communities across Africa. They don't understand just how devastating colonialism has been for so many people. And I think that's where a lot of the reluctance has come from, because you're being told to learn something completely different to what you understood growing up. And that for a lot of people can be pretty dissonant and difficult to get your head around. But my hope is that people won't choose to take these things personally, and instead they will feel a personal appreciation for actually understanding what actually occurred during this time, and having a better understanding of our shared histories.
How has this conference impacted the way these former colonies, particularly African colonies, place themselves in the world today when it comes to just international interaction and the way deals are done, and trade and international politics and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, you still have, a lot of countries across Africa who have strong ties with their former, colonial rulers. But also the way in which the conference created these countries. As I said, these countries were essentially built to fail. And these countries were essentially created as business arrangements. And so that is what these countries are having to reckon with up until today. And the way in which African countries are considered when it comes to sort of trade deals, and when it comes to the way in which we are treated, it really has had a lingering impact, and it's had a negative impact on our abilities to present who we are to the rest of the world as individual countries. And that is really the legacy of the Berlin Conference. It really started something that has been, devastated modern Africa. And I think when you better understand that, then you start to see African countries very differently, and you start to actually think that, what an incredible job for the last 60 years people from across the continent have done, in spite of what they inherited from the colonial era.
You travel around, you do talks at schools, and you speak to young people about this issue. What are the common questions they ask you?
Yeah, it's one of the most exciting parts of this journey I've gone on as an author is being able to talk to young people, and a younger generation who don't tie their identities to colonialism are fascinated by the realities of modern Africa. That they ask questions about, my own identity, my own upbringing, Nigeria. They ask questions about, why it's taken so long for us to better understand the realities of colonialism. They want to know more about the ongoing debates about the stolen artifacts, and they want to know how they can get involved in these discussions. They're comfortable with conversations around race and identity and history and colonialism, and so they want to be a part of these discussions. They want to, get involved, and that is something that's really heartening. And I think that's the importance of education for me. I see that when you go and you speak to people who do not tie these things to their own particular identities, then there is this openness to really want to see a change come about.
Okay. Dipo Faloyin, journalist and author. It's been very interesting getting your thoughts. Thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.